Let's talk one of the greatest teams in UConn history, the 1998-99 national champion UConn Huskies. You're locked on UConn.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive into today's show, just want to take a quick moment to say thank you to everyone that supported the show and ask you for a small favor. If you're enjoying the content here, please take a second to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcast. Subscribe on YouTube, follow on Apple, Spotify. It really helps the show grow. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your support. It means the world to me. It means the world to Locked On Network. And also, every follow, every subscription, every download of this podcast helps create more revenue for the UConn NIL, as we are giving a 10% donation to Bleeding Blue for Good. By supporting Locked On UConn, you're directly affecting the UConn athletic program, and I can't thank you enough for being a part of this community. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, put in the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first order. Well, as I mentioned in the open, we're going to talk about the 1998-99 UConn Huskies as a part of our Connecticut's team series. When something so amazing happens, sometimes it's really hard to go back and think about the little stories that you may have missed, reminiscing about it. Sometimes it loses some of the value, but in this scenario, I don't think that applies for the 1999 national champion UConn Huskies. The season they had, how they won, the personalities on this team that have reverberated through history of UConn athletics, and they're just worth celebrating and visiting on a regular basis. So I'm taking the time today to talk about the OGs of Connecticut champions on the men's side, the 1998-99 UConn Huskies. The season itself, when you look at it from a 30,000-foot view, 34-2, 16-2 in the Big East, finished third in the final AP poll before the NCAA tournament. Coached by the incomparable Jim Calhoun, who was labeled, as you'll hear later in the show, by CBS analysts Jim Nantz and Billy Packer as maybe is this the year? Is this the year that he's finally going to do it? Even in the Sweet 16 in Iowa with Gus Johnson and his partner talking about they've gotten only so close. So Jim Calhoun, three-time national champion, was once considered the best coach to not win a title. This team averaged 77.2 points per game and gave up about 61 a game. So they were a really good defensive team and pretty damn good on offense, almost 80 a game. They were led by, I'm just going to read their entire roster because everybody on this team deserves credit. We all know the names: Richard Hamilton, Khalid El-Amin, Kevin Freeman, Ricky Moore, Albert Mooring, Edmund Saunders, Jake Voskuhl, Rashmel Jones, Suleiman Wan, E.J. Harrison, Antrick Kleber, Ed Tanella, Richard Moore, and Stanley Ositi. The 98-99 team, they were special. They returned leaders Kevin Freeman, Jake Voskuhl, Rashmel Jones, Ricky Moore, and had an All-American Richard Hamilton, as well as a sophomore point guard, Khalid El-Amin. That backcourt was my favorite. Khalid El-Amin and Ricky Moore. Obviously, you could put Rip in there on the wing. I don't think it's so hard for me when I say that because, God, Kevin Freeman, Jake Voskuhl, these guys were so fantastic. And as we talk about this, especially when we get to the title game, the amount of contributions just in that Duke final game, when you go back and rewatch that game, is incredible. They started off hot, as they should. Got to number one in the AP poll. If you look at their record, started off 19-0. Easy wins against Quinnipiac, Richmond, Hartford. God, Wagner, they just smoked 111-46. Had a dominant win over against a top 15 Pac-10 team, 69-48 against Washington, Washington Huskies. A big win, top 10 Michigan State and Tom Izzo. at Campbell Pavilion. That's something that we'll talk about later because a lot of fans have that in their memories. Won that game by 14 points. Tough game against the Minuteman in Massachusetts at the Mullins Center, winning that game 59-54. Another knockdown, drag-out fight against Pittsburgh at Fitzgerald Fieldhouse. At that time, Pittsburgh was top 20 in the country in the Big East. Win that game by 1. Then they go on a murder spree. They destroy Fairfield. They crush Villanova. They crush Georgetown pretty handily against Boston College. Absolutely destroy West Virginia by 35 points. Notre Dame by 30. And then they play Pittsburgh at home, and they beat them by 23 points. This team was a unit. At that point, they're 15-0. At Miami, they win in overtime. Tough game. Seton Hall game. They win by 13 points. Beat Georgetown. Beat St. John's, who was top 10 in the country, and they handled them. It was a close game, but they got to 19-0. It was at Madison Square Garden. That St. John's team was a top 10 program. Then a little bit of the injury bug happened, and this is where some interesting stuff happened. UConn loses this game to Syracuse. But if you go back and you look at some of the press clippings, if you look at some of the things, Jim Calhoun, just absolute. Sorry, I had to pause for a sneeze there. Yeah, Jim Calhoun was fantastic because UConn's number 1 in the country. They're playing against Syracuse, and Syracuse beats them 59-42. And yes, we were without Jake Voskuhl and Richard Hamilton. But the funny thing about this is this is what I always respect about Jim Calhoun. Some of the quotes from this. Obviously, I feel bad for Richard and Jake, 2 very good kids, 2 very good players. This is Jim Boeheim talking about it, but we just needed to get a win and we didn't care who was playing. So that's classic Boeheim there. This is Calhoun. We did dress 5 people who could play. Richard and Jake didn't make any mistakes, so there were no factors in the game. I thought the guys on the floor would do a better job. We just played St. John's without their best rebounder, and we were lucky to win. We had other guys who could have stepped up and tried to stop penetration and hit shots. There's nothing wrong with our record, but there is something wrong with what happened tonight. So he did not let this go by as like, well, we didn't have our best players. You know what I mean? So Ricky Moore, who you'll hear from in this episode, is taking accountability on this too. That they weren't shooting well. That's fine, but we still should have stepped up on defense. He was always the consummate leader. The shots weren't falling tonight because they had 4 guys in the perimeter. We didn't have enough guys stepping up in the foul line, asking for the ball, but that's not why we lost. We just let up on defense. And Calhoun was upset. We didn't get any loose balls. We had some guys up there tonight that we can play, and they didn't, and that's disappointing. So what does this all mean in the grand scheme of things? Last quote from this is from Edmund Saunders. Actually had a big game that day, so because he had 14 points, he was their only player in double figures. I don't remember the game specifically, but I remember my dad being pissed off at the effort too. This is Calhoun, classic love-hate relationship. I told them as soon as the game was over, I am very proud of their 19-0 start. That was a tremendous, tremendous job. I'll probably start the same guy Saturday at number 4 Stanford, and maybe some people will be better players. I'm upset, and I should be. That's the reason why he was as great as he was, because he did not let them slip. When we come back, I asked some fans what their thoughts were, and we'll talk about who said what and some of the fan reactions from this historic 98-99 national champion team coming up after this. All right, you're back on Locked On UConn, a special episode of Connecticut's team celebrating the 98-99 national champions. My first memory, not first, but one of my biggest memories was I remember going to the Sweet 16 game. I was kind of nervous. Iowa had some good shooters. Gonzaga had already beat Florida, so I just didn't want them to not get an opportunity to end up playing a 10 seed to get to the Final Four, something that they'd never done before. So, and I remember vividly when that game started that the broadcasters were like, this team's been close, but no cigar. Can't get much closer than they are. They lost by 1 in 1990, 95, 98. Is this the year for Jim Calhoun? That's my like crystal clear memory of that season. And then obviously the Gonzaga game was intense. But Matt Edwards, who from the Dream Season podcast, sent me a message and said, going to the Michigan State game at Gamble, finally climbing the ladder against Gonzaga, and obviously 77-74. That's the UConn Duke score. I remember everything about that day, March 29th, 1999. And don't you worry, Matt, we're going to cover all of the pageantry of the 1999 finals. Then I asked Aaron Torres of the Aaron Torres podcast, UConn alum. He said nothing immediate comes to mind, honestly, but would probably just say that while it's easy to pretend like this wasn't the case now, legitimately no one outside of Connecticut believed they could actually beat Duke. And trust me, I watched the entire broadcast from start to finish. Aaron Torres is prophetic in that, because the only person that said that they had a chance, a slight chance at that, was Clark Kellogg, because he believed that if UConn pushed the ball, that Duke wouldn't be able to kind of set up in the half court, let Elton Brand dominate, et cetera, et cetera. Also, no one knew that Jim Calhoun was gonna pull the big to big and double, not on the perimeter, but with other forwards. So that kind of threw Duke for a loop. Brian Frederick, my buddy, who's the head coach over at Platt University, at Platt High School in Meriden, one of my buddies from Meriden, Connecticut, he said, beating Michigan State and sweeping Georgetown was big. Winning the Big East tournament, that Gonzaga game was intense, and obviously being Duke in the finals for the Natty. And then, of course, for our comic relief, not really, but Big Larry is, I love Big Larry. He said, I have a couple memories. I got to see their first round games that year because they were in Denver, and I had just moved out after I graduated. My memories were those at El-Amin on top of the table of the year before. Spent a night at a party in Carriage House telling Rip he needed to stay and we'd win the Natty, and they did. Also, the St. John's game sticks out to me. So Big Larry got an assist for keeping Rip at UConn because he had him at a party at Carriage House and told him he had to stay. So gotta love that. Yeah, I mean, there's a few more. I know. Sorry if you sent me one and I didn't get to it, but my biggest thing about this team, we're going to talk about all of essentially the tournament itself. But when we come back, I want to take some time to walk you through the game of UConn versus Duke. And when you listen to this podcast, do yourself a favor, spend 2 hours. It may take you a couple days like me because I did it in parts. And listen to the show first and then go back and rewatch the broadcast. And you'll get some laughs out of it. You'll get some excitement. You'll probably have the same butterflies that I did when I rewatched it because I'm crazy like that. I know the outcome. I know everything that's about to happen. But, you find some little things that excite you, and it's UConn basketball. There's not much like it. So when we return, we're going to talk about the game of games. I know there were games to lead up to it. Can't discount that. But the only game that matters now that it's over is the game that we beat Duke for our first national championship. So when we return, we'll talk about that coming up after this. Well, we're back on Locked On UConn, celebrating the 98-99 national champions, UConn Huskies. I don't know if you can see the shirt, but it says on the bottom, we shocked the world. And we'll get into that pretty shortly here. One of the things I will say that this season brought me is a little closer to this team and this university, because the first team I really, truly enjoyed, and then obviously have been a fan ever since, was that Jim Calhoun NIT championship team. And then eventually the dream season, 89-90, where we got our hearts ripped out by Duke. And, this is like a mini version of what Matt Edwards in the Dream Season pod has done and inspired me to get involved in some UConn content. So this season was pretty, I want to say like a roller coaster. It was amazing. You start off 19-0, then you have the disappointing game against Syracuse. Then you pretty much go on another mini 4-game winning streak, beating Big East opponents like a drum. Only really had an issue with Seton Hall. That was like a really close, low-scoring game. I think some guys are still coming back from injury there. And then lose only the second game of the year in Gamble Pavilion against the 15th-ranked Miami Hurricanes team. And But all in all, it was like a very similar to the 2024 season where, you pretty much ran through the season with a few hiccups, 2 losses to 3 losses versus the 2 championship teams. And really, when at full strength, this UConn Husky team was probably the most difficult team to guard and to play against because of how deep they were. And we're going to talk about that once we get to the title game. And then also the contributions they got from seniors like Roshmel Jones. That just typically doesn't happen anymore. Like, grad assistants, transfers, but guys who had been in the program for multiple years, 3-4 years, that when their number was called, they stepped up in a huge way. And so they entered the NCAA tournament as a 1 seed. They were finished the year number 3 overall, like number 3 in the country, I guess the 3rd overall seed. There was some talk, you'll even, not hear it, but if you go back and listen to the UConn versus Duke national championship game, there was even talk about at that time on the selection show who would get the East. And obviously Duke did. They were the number 1 overall seed. Finished 32-1, and UConn's entered the tournament at 28-2. So look, they were the 2 top teams all year. And frankly, I don't care who is 2 and 4. Doesn't make a difference. So they breezed through this tournament in very UConn fashion, crushed UTSA. They were out west at McNichols Sports Arena. The arena there was in Denver. I think Big Larry said that he got to see the first 2 games. So that's pretty cool for him when he was a young buck, just moving out to the Denver area. So shout out Big Larry. And then honestly, it was 2 tougher games. I wouldn't say they weren't knockdown dragouts. The Iowa game was tough. It's a Big Ten team. They were ranked in the top 25. I think they were a 5 seed at the time. As I said, I think this was the game where I was just like, wow, this is real. Like they really, truly, legitimately are going to be favored again to get to the Final Four. Because Gonzaga had made a Cinderella run. It's the first of kind of Gonzaga's now identity of being a really solid basketball program and an elite program in the country. But that was Dan Munson, not Mark Few, the guy who kind of led them initially and then left for Minnesota. The Minnesota job came calling and he took it. But he led them on that Cinderella ride, and they came up against UConn. And we've talked about this game before on the pod. It was very sloppy, intense. I think the weight of being the first team to get to the Final Four to climb that ladder, as Matt Edwards put it, was daunting. And so it was like tied, or they were up 1 at half, and then UConn really put the clamps on them, and eventually just kind of choked them, suffocated them, and got a hard fought 67-62 victory in the America West Arena. I think they call it U.S. Airways Center, but that's where the Great Western Forum is, where it was where the Phoenix Suns played. So I remember that vividly. The sun that was on that parquet floor. So then the interesting thing is you go to the Final Four, and we're going to take a quick break and run through those 2 games, show some video from my interview with Ricky Moore, and a couple of things that I thought were interesting about the finals coming up after this. Welcome back to the final segment of the 1999 National Championship celebration. I've never done one of these before, so really wanted to take my time with it and really give my impressions. This is not a game-by-game scenario. This is, a 17-year-old's recollection, and now about to be 43. So 26 years later, kind of looking back on this, it's been pretty fun to do. But this Final Four game in particular was Michael Redd and Scooney Penn. Those were their guys. Very similar to us. They had a really solid backcourt. But little did they know that we had secret weapons on defense of Ricky Moore to shut down Scooney Penn and Kevin Freenan to shut down Michael Redd. Michael Redd gave us more problems than Scooney Penn. I think Ricky Moore was, I'm sure Ricky would agree with this. I don't know if Kevin would agree, but I think Ricky was the better defender. And he showed it on a regular basis. Nothing against Kevin. I think he did a phenomenal job most of the time. But I remember that UConn got out to like a 16-11 lead in that game. And then then Ohio State kind of switched up to zone, kind of messed them up a little bit. They've seen zone. They've seen Syracuse in their league at that time. But little mini run by the Buckeyes got them to a 17-16 lead. Then UConn started to come and run with great behind-the-back pass. It's on every highlight you'll ever see from this tournament. The in transition behind the back up pass up ahead to Kevin Freeman for an and one. But the run continued with Richard Hamilton capping the stretch where we didn't miss 6 straight shots. So it was kind of like a 12. I don't know if it was a 12-0 run, but it got us up to 32-23 where he was on the fast break and pulled up from 10 feet pure. My dad used to love that. That's like old school basketball, not taking it all the way to the hoop, just pulling up from 10 feet. They can't really stop it, and you shoot and you either make it or miss it. And my guy made it. But they're on the 7-minute mark. From the 7-minute mark to about the 2-minute mark, the largest lead of the half was 32-23. But after that, Ohio State goes on a 10-0 run during that 5-minute stretch and really holds UConn in check. They go up by 1 until it was like a lazy play. They kick it ahead to Rip on the wing. He like fakes like he's going to shoot a 3 and then just dribbles up for an easy layup to put them back up 1. This team always seemed to recover, even in stretches where things weren't going their way. And that was no different there. Richard Hamilton was a monster in this game. Him and Khalid El-Amin led the way. Rip and Khalid had 24 and 18 points respectively in this game. And it got a little dicey. There was a point where I felt, I'll set the stage for you. I was at my friend Tim's house, his parents' house, and we were seniors in high school. He was the only Duke fan of our group. So their game was coming up next. The rest of us were Connecticut fans. Don't ask me why. I don't really remember why he's a Duke fan, but I think it was a Wojo thing. And Tim was never really an arrogant guy. Like you think of Duke fans, you think of kind of pompous, elite, not the nicest people in the world. Although I have some Duke friends who are nice, but you get the point. At that time, they were the elite team in college basketball, and UConn was still trying to kind of pry its way into the top dog conversation. And Tim was never, didn't rub anything in my face, but he's sitting there watching me sweat this game out over a Subway BMT, and UConn looking pretty good in the second half, but it was really just about keeping Ohio State and Michael Redd at bay because Ricky took care of Scooney, as we mentioned. But where I was pretty comfortable was late in the second half. Richard Hamilton hits a double clutch shot with 1 second on the clock, and it puts them up 61-55. And there I'm sitting there going, this could be it. We could be playing for the title on Monday. And I just felt great about it. And it wasn't, I wasn't getting indigestion because of Subway and that BMT. I was 17 years old, but Ohio State starts to, foul and is a wild exchange. And there's a, kind of an moment. Are we going to blow this? When Edmund Saunders misses a 1-and-1 and Ohio State's coming back down the court with about 30 seconds left. And they miss multiple threes, including one that almost really went in with Michael Redd. And eventually, after basically beating each other up for the last minute and a half, UConn would seal the deal 64-58, ironically, on a Edmund Saunders free throw. So UConn fans start chanting, "We want Duke. We want Duke." And then as they're rolling out this kind of exchange, you can see the score, Connecticut 64, Ohio State 58. If you're watching on YouTube, that was the final sign-off there in the national semifinal. Khalid El-Amin giving the dap up to Scooney Penn, battled it out. And we move on. And our fans are chanting, "We want Duke." And I did too. I did not want to win this against Michigan State. Tom Izzo's first Final Four, first Final Four for Michigan State since 1979. So they were making their, not their most recent appearance, obviously. And it leads into the next segment because we all know that Duke ended up winning and we ended up playing them in the finals. And something that I talked to Ricky about when I was a kid, when I was a senior in high school, everybody at that time was listening to DMX's It's Dark and Hell is Hot album. And they started coming out to Rough Riders. If you don't know what I mean, this is what I mean. I played this song throughout the entire championship game in the basement of my parents' house. So, let me show you what Ricky said about the idea of playing the Rough Riders anthem song as a walkout for themselves. Who chose that? What was the impetus of that? And did that get you guys fired up? Because I know my old self still even listens to that in the gym today if I'm trying to fire myself up.
Yeah, I think that was one of the songs that pretty much everybody on the team was listening to. So that was what we decided to come out and sing, and definitely got us hyped and got us ready to play and amped up. So, but yeah, everybody was listening to that during that time. And so, I think it was a mutual thing amongst the team that was something that we were going to do as we walked out to the court.
Yeah. And I will tell you that permeated everything from age, race, nationality, because our tennis team used to play that song coming out to it in high school. Forget about football, basketball, baseball.
He's in tennis.
Tennis players were coming out to that song. I still laugh every time I see that clip. Ricky goes, "You said tennis." At the time, we thought we were tough. I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, that was wild to me that they were coming out to that, because that was like our anthem. And but let's get into this game. Stage is set. I went back and watched this entire game again in preparation for this show. And some observations. I'm going to run through this entire game. So, like I said, I hope that you guys rewatch this game after you listen to this podcast. So, starts off, only two teams that have been ranked number one all season. Almost predestined, Greg Cumble says. They're 70-3 combined record overall. Clark Kellogg, I don't know if he can be stopped, talking about Elton Brand. Ricky Moore versus William Avery was a hot topic because they were high school teammates. Corey Maggette, Edmund Saunders were talked about as the top people off the bench, right? So the stage is set. Tropicana Field. Bonnie Bernstein is asking questions to Jim Calhoun and Khalid El-Amin. How do you find ways to beat Duke? And all Jim Calhoun was like, they're a tough team, et cetera. But the toughest thing for him is the waiting before the game. And once the game starts, you coach it like any other game. And Bonnie asked Khalid the same question, and that's where you get the famous, "We plan to shock the world today." Words that would ring so true as we go on in the next 2 hours. So Armin Katayan comes on to talk about the Duke stuff. They don't interview Coach K, but Armin says, our tournament, that's what they were. They printed out these sheets and put it in every a kid's locker at Duke, talking about how this was their tournament and they're not shying away from this is their tournament to lose. And it's interesting because when you go back and watch the coverage, they go to a pre-recorded interview of Coach K and Calhoun. And Calhoun was very deferential and respectful. And I think Coach K can be classy, but in this scenario, he comes off as pretty pompous, and I'm biased, but pregame, he's saying stuff like, how are they going to defend our guys? Nothing about, how they're going to handle Ricky Moore or how they're going to handle Richard Hamilton or Kevin Freeman or anybody. So just an observation, take it for what it's worth. So, the game starts, and the biggest question was, of course, how are they going to handle Elton Brand? He's the National Player of the Year. He's probably the likely number 1 overall pick. He eventually was. And they start trying to match big to big, 2-3 matchup out of the inbounds. There's a quick turnover for the Huskies on a 2-2-1 full court press. It causes a turnover right away. So it's kind of like back and forth. And my favorite early play was Kevin Freeman swatting Trajan Langdon's 3. And of course, you're going to hear a lot about Billy Packer, because if you listen to that again, he is all over this game. He inserts himself into these silly scenarios that we were going to laugh at today to get today together. He says, yeah, great block, but that's what Duke will shoot long threes on the break. He's always kind of set. It felt like there was always a backhanded compliment. And then at this moment in the game, they start going, can Duke tie North Carolina for the fourth all time in tournament? So I want you to look at this display. Shining moments, NCAA tournament titles. At this time, March 29th, 1999, or 27th, I think it's the 29th. UCLA had 11. They still do. Kentucky had 7. They have 8 now. Indiana has 5. They still do. And North Carolina has 3. North Carolina now has 5. So Duke was going for their 3rd. It's crazy to look at this. And now knowing that we are behind only Kentucky and UCLA for the most national championships in men's history. Pretty incredible stuff, considering this was the first visit and it was just 26 years ago. So I digress. Let's move that along, but I thought you guys would want to check that out. That was a really cool graphic from the CBS broadcast. So as we move on in this game, Shane Battier hits a 3 to put Duke up 7-2. And I was just like, we're in trouble. And then it was followed up with a little, as Billy Rafter would say, nickel dimer. And it wasn't looking good. A lot of things were going against them. All of a sudden they're down 9-2, and El-Amin travels. And I'm sitting here going, we better not get blown out. And I initially turned off the Rough Riders anthem after they came out to it, but I turned that back on. And I was like, I'm putting this on repeat on my stupid Sony little beatbox that was probably like this big, and played that on repeat in my parents' basement because I watched it separate. My parents were watching it upstairs. I watched it downstairs as I'm a psycho. And then Ricky Moore happened. So I'm not saying I'm taking credit for changing the juju, but I did a pretty good job of, in my opinion, from a superstitious standpoint. So first bucket to the hole for 2, and then another. Now it's 6 points in the first half. 3 blocks in the first half for Kevin Freeman. Corey Maggette is in, and looks like he's playing a different speed than almost anybody else. I can't imagine how many times Coach K kicks himself for not playing Corey Maggette like 40 minutes in this game. Because if Corey Maggette plays in this game, that would have made a huge difference. I don't know if they would have beat us, but it certainly wouldn't have. I don't think it would have gotten to the point where they had to kind of claw back into it at the end. And maybe they do beat us. Who knows? But then Ricky Moore drains another 3. He's got 9 points. Not what Duke expected at all, Billy Packer says. Probably the only time I agreed with him in the whole broadcast. For all the hatred that Billy gets from UConn fans, and my dad included, I think he deserves some credit. God rest his soul. He did make some great points about the 12-minute mark in the first half of the UConn final against Duke, where Ricky Moore has had this in his bag, and Ricky talked about it, where there weren't so many opportunities when you have all of the All-Americans and the guys on your team, scorers like Khalid. But I thought Packer bringing up what he did in the Big East final against Allen Iverson and Georgetown was a great point. So I want you guys to hear it from Ricky himself.
No, I think that's safe to say. I think a lot of times, I wouldn't do a whole lot of talking, but I would show it by my actions and my work ethic. So I think when I spoke, guys would listen, and I had their respect because I put the work in first. So a lot of times when guys try to be leaders and their teammates don't see them working, it's kind of hard to listen to somebody like that. But when your teammates see you're grinding it out and working hard every day, waking up 6 o'clock in the morning, getting shots up, you might not necessarily get 5 or 6 shots in a game, but you're putting the work in because you never know when that opportunity is going to present itself, and you must be ready. So I think that's what happened in the Final Four. I know in the Duke game, Khalid got in foul trouble, and I scored 14 points in the first half. And I don't think my teammates were shocked because they would see that in practice, just that competitive nature. So I think a lot of people were shocked in that game because I typically didn't score the ball like that. And those opportunities weren't there either. So, our two guys, going into the game, we knew it was going to be Rip and Khalid putting up the most shots. So, when I had the opportunity to score, I just tried to make sure that I was ready and prepared for that opportunity before it got there.
There's Ricky Moore talking about the opportunity presented himself, and he took it. He was also talking about how there was reports at halftime of the Ohio State game when they were up 10, and then they lost their 10 or 9-point lead, and they were down 1, and then they were only up 1 at halftime. He kind of ripped into the team, and normally didn't do that. He more of an action versus words guy. So that was that initial context. But I wanted you guys to hear that little snippet of our interview from last spring. As we go along in this game, one of my favorite moments in the entire game rewatching is Edmond Saunders drives to the hoop, misses, and Elton Brand grabs the rebound, and him and Suleiman Wan are like really pressing him and doubling him in the backcourt. And Billy Packer says, they better not try to take that ball away with those powerful hands. He must have been talking about his hands pretty much for a 3 or 4 minute stretch. And then Jim Nance's next words are, ball is stripped. And now Wan and Packer is incredulous. You don't see that often without a foul. If you have time, just go back and watch that play. It's worth searching just for that time. So if you're not going to watch the whole thing, we cut the lead to 23-20. Loved Edmond Saunders, mean mugging Elton Brand after that. It got me so fired up. So El-Amin goes out with just over 9 minutes to go with his first with 2 fouls. So Ricky Moore. It's more looking like UConn can stay with Duke to the very end. Very awkward moment from Jim Nance. If you watch it, you will definitely see that. Then Billy Packer with, they're not calling too many charges out here. Next play, Richard Hamilton takes a charge. Like, not joking, verbatim on Chris Carroll, and he laughs. Trajan Langdon, 4-point play, gives Duke a 3-point lead, and Richard Hamilton's free throw cuts it to 2. So Duke is up 39-37 at the half. In a year where UConn was 9-0 when trailing at the half, Jim Nance throws that stat out. Second half just starts to flow. I really went back and looked at the halftime. There really wasn't anything interesting. It was just, interesting that I guess UConn was going big to big double, that they weren't really being hurt by William Avery and due to Ricky Moore. So that was pretty much it. All stuff that everyone knows. Everyone was surprised about Ricky Moore, even though as he told you, that's something that he was capable of. So the second half starts. It's in a good flow. Langdon is hot as a pistol. 5 quick points. And I'm uneasy again, feeling I had when they started the game up 9-2. I started to have, when Duke extended the lead to 5 in the first half. And then a quick bucket by Kevin Freeman quells that anxiety. So one of the prevailing themes of this game is unsung heroes. Always ready. Albert Mooring, number 23. Well, Jim Calhoun used to call him the best shooter on the team. I don't know if I agree with him. Maybe he saw that in practice more, but kid was always ready to put up numbers. Roshmel Jones, a 13-point scorer as sophomore year, was a senior this year. At that time, was only putting up like 4 points a game, getting 10, 12 minutes a game, but always ready. Suleiman Wan, at this point, at this game, it was Mooring with a drive and pull up to cut the lead to 3. Really, at that's the moment I was very comfortable that UConn is going to have a great chance in the second half as they settled into a second half. And then same thing, Suleiman Wan hits a turnaround 12-footer over Elton Brand on the baseline, and my 17-year-old brain went insane. And I was convinced we were going to win. That's one of those fluky moments. Nothing against Wan, because he's my guy. I have a sticker collection. He's definitely one of them. And but I was convinced, like, this guy doesn't make those shots very often, not in big games. We're going to win this game. And then Albert Mooring with a layup and an and 1. I mean, it was a lock at that point. I'm thinking UConn now up 5 with Edmond Saunders with 9 minutes to go to the game, walking to the free throw line for a 1-and-1. And Jim Nance utters the words, Duke in territory it is totally unfamiliar with. And I remember those words, not just because I saw it, but I remember looking at that and I said, it rhymes with duck. Yeah. Duck, yeah, they are. That's exactly what I said at that time. Very loud. My parents probably weren't happy at the time. But and then Billy Packer's been openly basically saying, like, pleading for Coach K, take a timeout. You're getting tired. But he was waiting for a TV timeout as UConn is gassed at this point, gassing this Duke squad. Jim Calhoun, masterclass. I cannot say that enough. He puts in Antrick Kleber as the 11th man off the bench, the 11th guy that's played in the title game. This isn't a first-round game. And now he's got Freeman and Voskuhl to rest for the stretch run. It's 16-8 bench points for UConn at that point. And I know Duke had a probably pound for pound the better team of starters. But, man, did Jim Calhoun put Coach K in a spin cycle for this from the doubling big to big, for the, putting Khalid El-Amin on the bench because he knew Ricky Moore is capable of picking up the scoring. Same thing with Rashamel Jones, getting contributions from Albert Mooring. So, and we're back to being on the Billy Packer hate train. Elton Brand runs the floor. Again, watch this. After a block, and Packer is literally rooting for Duke. Man, you can talk about being in shape, he said, after he just spent 2 minutes waxing poetic about how Coach K needs a timeout to get his guys some rest. And Packer calls Elton Brand is stepping up like a heavyweight champion. I didn't watch this game with my father, but if I did, he probably said something like, "Oh, blank Billy Packer." I can't make it up. Under 8 minute timeout, we're up 2. Duke was in the 1-1 for almost the entire second part of the second half. UConn did an amazing job to limit Duke's transition threes. It's much to Billy Packer's chagrin. Again, rooting for Duke on Voskuhl's monster block. But what I loved about the broadcast, and I remember because it brought me a tiny tear in my eye, was Jim Nantz references Jim Calhoun talking about, we came to the Final Four not just for this team, but for the ones who came before them. Guys like Lyman DePriest, Chris Smith, Nadav Hennefeld, Danielle Marshall, Travis Knight were mentioned, but also for the guys like Rod Sellers, Terreno Walker, Ray Allen, Duron Sheffer, Brian Fair, John Gwynn, to add a few more. And they show Ray watching the crowd with none other than Steph Curry's dad, Del Curry. I mean, no lie. Like, they're together at the game. They must have came together. So if you remember that 94 team, great mention from Jim Nantz, but of course, Billy comes in to throw cold water on all of the UConn success. He goes, Billy, he says, you remember that 94 team, they lost in overtime to Florida. Yes, Billy, we all remember. Thank you for crapping on our team. The back and forth led mostly to free throws, in the game being either UConn up 2 or tied, with Richard Hamilton to the free throw line to give UConn a 2-point lead with the under 4 minute mark. And then Jim Nantz starts talking about Aju Deng and how he's the next grade at UConn. So, of course, I'm fired up at that time. I remember being like, wow, that's great. We can all focus on this game, but, can we get this title first before we worry about Aju Deng? Of course, I talked about him after the game. But, so they come back from commercial. We almost get a steal in the backcourt, and then Ricky Moore shows up again defensively this time with a pocket pick of his buddy William Avery, pushes it up after Elton Brand tried to anticipate a steal on a switch, and Hamilton on a switch on Hamilton, and he does a quick little step through. Rip calmly hits a 3 to put UConn up 5, 73-68. And I'm literally doing the exact same thing at this point that Suleiman Wan was doing, which is like on the floor doing this and hand to the face saying, let's go. Now we have 2:15 remaining, up 4. I'm back to being nervous after a couple turnovers. Coach K calls timeout, 22nd. Remember, though, throughout this whole game, I'm listening to DMX, Rough Riders Anthem. Trajan Langdon hits a 3, and Jim Calhoun calls a timeout now, and I'm having PTSD going back to 10 years earlier against this very Duke squad in the Elite Eight. Khalid, my guy, does a pick and roll with Voskuhl, and he does this little hezzy and jumps up for a floater to give UConn a lead back up 3. Less than a minute to play after William Avery's free throws. It's UConn up 1 with the ball as time ticks away. After Khalid El-Amin misses a shot to put UConn up 3, I'm convinced down 1. Now we're going to lose this game at the buzzer to Duke. And I'm going to have to listen to Tim and every other Duke fan in the world talk about it was their destiny, and it's our destiny to be snake bitten and be the little brother. Looking back, another Coach K mistake was about to happen, because Trajan Langdon versus Ricky Moore to try to win the game was a mistake. He should have called a timeout, set something up for Brand or even William Avery, who had more off of him at that time. And I'll take Ricky Moore over Trajan Langdon any day of the week, one-on-one. And lo and behold, Trajan tries to go by him to the hole, travels. Even Billy Packer agreed with me. So he got one thing right, at least from the game, or two things. I think we gave him some praise earlier. Surprised they went after the number one defender in the tournament, and then they showed tears of the family of Coach K. And at that point, at my young age, I was happy. I probably did something like this. No disrespect to Coach K's wife, but I was so thrilled that she was upset about that. So now the stage is set. Khalid El-Amin is 0 for 2 tonight. He's a 79% free throw shooter. He swishes the first one. All I'm thinking at this point is make this one, and we can't lose on a three. Second one rattles home, and then we see Langdon trip and not get a shot up. And El-Amin shocked the world. Ricky Moore saying, they don't know. They don't know. And I'm going crazy. I ran upstairs to hug my parents, and then I ran out, and we drove to my friend's house, who was a Duke fan, Tim, and honked our horns like psychopaths. Unreal. To Jim Calhoun, all of the players on that team, amazing to hear Calhoun talk about Cliff Robinson post-game. Great stuff from the GOAT. We're going to take this back to Connecticut and thank the best fans in the world. I'll close out the show to say, I didn't see this part because I was too busy celebrating, but Greg Grumble pregame, Khalid El-Amin said, we're going to go out and shock the world. And well, that's just what they did. And also, as we show one more picture of Richard Hamilton carrying the trophy of the national champion UConn Huskies, Coach K had the last word, and I thought he was very cordial and really kind of gave Coach Calhoun and the Huskies their due. He said, I thought we were beaten tonight. We didn't lose. We got beat by a great team, and my hat's off to Jim. That was a tough basketball team, very difficult to defend. So I just remember I didn't see any of that, so that was really cool to see. So now, as the one shining moment is going to be played, the DMX theme comes back out as they go to one shining moment. UConn celebrating with stop, drop, shut them down, open up shop. Just unreal. My mind was blown. I was so happy for that moment, and I'm so happy that this was Connecticut's team in their first championship. So let's celebrate the 1999 national champions, the UConn Huskies. This has been an extra special, longer version of Locked On UConn. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy. Be well.